The police arrived at Windsor Park within 10 minutes of James's phone call. Two police officers in uniform came walking quickly along the path toward the bench, where James and Harold were sitting. The officers looked professional and ready to handle whatever situation they might find. James stood up when he saw the police approaching and showed them his military identification. "I'm Sergeant Mitchell, the person who called you," James said to the officers. "These are the three suspects who attempted to rob this elderly gentleman." The police officers looked at Jake, Tommy, and Carl, who were still sitting on the ground looking defeated and sorry for themselves. The officers could see immediately that the three young men were no longer a threat to anyone. "What exactly happened here?" asked the first police officer, taking out a notebook to write down the details of the incident. James and Harold took turns explaining everything that had occurred. Harold described how the three young men had surrounded him, threatened him, and demanded his money and walking cane. James explained how he had observed the situation, intervened to help Harold, and used necessary force to stop the three attackers. The police officers listened carefully to both statements and wrote down all the important details. They also spoke to Jake, Tommy, and Carl, who had no choice but to admit what they had done. The evidence was clear, and there were no doubts about who was guilty and who was innocent. "You three are under arrest for attempted robbery and assault," the second police officer told Jake, Tommy, and Carl. "You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can be used against you in court." As the police officers handcuffed the three young men and prepared to take them away, Carl turned to Harold with tears in his eyes. "I'm really sorry, sir," Carl said sincerely. "What we did was wrong, and I feel terrible about scaring you. I promise I'll never do anything like this again." Harold looked at Carl with a mixture of sadness and hope. Harold could see that Carl genuinely regretted his actions and might be able to change his life for the better. "I forgive you," Harold said kindly, "but you need to choose better friends and make better decisions in the future." Jake and Tommy were led away without saying anything. They still seemed angry and defiant, and Harold doubted that they had learned anything from this experience. But Harold hoped that spending time in jail might help them understand the seriousness of their actions. After the police had taken the three young men away, James and Harold were left alone in the park again. The morning sun was now bright and warm, and the park was starting to fill with more people enjoying the beautiful day. "Well," Harold said with a smile, "that was certainly more excitement than I usually have on my morning walks." James laughed. "I hope your future walks are much more peaceful than this one was." Harold looked at James thoughtfully. "You know I would feel much safer on my walks if I had a strong young friend like you to keep me company sometimes. Would you be interested in joining an old veteran for his morning walks occasionally?" James was touched by Harold's invitation. James had greatly enjoyed talking with Harold and learning about his experiences during World War II. James also felt protective of Harold and wanted to make sure that nothing like this morning's incident ever happened to him again. "Would be honored to walk with you, sir," James said warmly. "I have most mornings off from my duties, and I love taking walks in this park. It would be my pleasure to have your company." Harold felt very happy about this arrangement. Harold had been feeling lonely since his wife Mary had died, and he looked forward to having a young friend to talk with during his daily walks. Over the following weeks and months, James and Harold developed a strong friendship. James would meet Harold at his house several mornings each week, and they would walk together through Windsor Park. They talked about their military experiences, their families, their hopes, and their memories. Harold learned that James had grown up in a small town in northern England and had joined the army because he wanted to serve his country and travel the world. James had served in Afghanistan and had earned several medals for his bravery and leadership. James was proud of his service but remained humble about his accomplishments. James learned that Harold had met his wife Mary at a dance after the war ended. They had been married for 68 years before Mary died of cancer. Harold had 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren who lived in different parts of England. Harold missed Mary every day but was grateful for the long, happy life they had shared together. The friendship between James and Harold became well known in their neighborhood. People would often see them walking together in the morning. The young soldier in his civilian clothes and the elderly veteran with his military cap and walking cane. Many people commented on what a nice sight it was to see 2 generations of soldiers supporting each other. One day, A local newspaper reporter heard about the incident in the park and the friendship that had grown from it. The reporter interviewed both James and Harold and wrote a story about their unusual meeting and lasting bond. The story was published with the headline, "Queen's Guard Rescues Wu Veteran Friendship Blooms." The newspaper story was shared on social media and quickly spread around the internet. People from all over the world read about James and Harold and were inspired by their story. Many people commented that it restored their faith in humanity to see how one act of kindness had led to such a meaningful friendship. Harold became something of a local celebrity because of the newspaper story. People would recognize him on his walks and stop to thank him for his service during the war. Harold enjoyed the attention and was proud to share his stories about what life was like during World War II. James was more uncomfortable with the public attention, but he was glad that Harold was getting the recognition he deserved. James believed that World War II veterans like Harold were true heroes who should be honored and remembered by younger generations. As time went on, James began to think of Harold almost like a grandfather. James's own grandparents had died when he was young, and he valued having an older, wiser person to talk to about life's challenges and opportunities. Harold began to think of James as the grandson he had always wanted. Harold's own grandchildren were wonderful, but they lived far away and were busy with their own lives. Having James nearby and available for regular conversations meant a great deal to Harold. On the first anniversary of their meeting in the park, James and Harold had a special celebration. They walked the same path where they had first met, and they visited the bench where they had sat together after the incident with the three young men. "You know," Harold said as they sat on the bench, "being threatened by those young thugs was one of the scariest experiences of my life. But I'm grateful that it happened because it brought you into my life." James smiled warmly. "I feel the same way. Meeting you has been one of the best things that has happened to me since I moved to Windsor. You've taught me so much about life, history, and what it means to serve with honor." Harold patted James on the shoulder in a fatherly way. "And you've shown me that the younger generation still has young people with courage, kindness, and respect for their elders. You give me hope for the future." As they continued their walk that morning, both men reflected on how much their lives had changed since that frightening day when three young criminals had tried to rob an elderly veteran. What had started as a dangerous situation had become the foundation for a friendship that enriched both of their lives. James continued to serve with the Queen's Guard, but now he had a deeper understanding of the history and traditions he was protecting. Harold continued to take his daily walks, but now he had a strong young friend to share his thoughts and memories with. The story of Harold Thompson and James Mitchell became a reminder to everyone who heard it that acts of courage and kindness can create lasting bonds between people of different generations. It showed that when good people stand up for what is right, beautiful things can happen even in the midst of frightening situations. Their friendship would continue for many years to come, a living testament to the values of honor, service, and mutual respect that both men held dear. After the three young men had been dealt with, James Mitchell immediately turned his attention to Harold Thompson. James could see that the elderly man was still shaken from the experience, and James wanted to make sure that Harold was not injured and felt safe. "Are you all right, sir?" James asked Harold with genuine concern in his voice. "Did they hurt you in any way?" Harold looked at James with eyes full of gratitude and amazement. "I'm fine, thanks to you," Harold said, his voice still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the frightening experience. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did." James gently took Harold's arm and guided him toward a nearby park bench. "Let's sit down for a moment so you can catch your breath," James said kindly. "That was a stressful situation, and it's normal to feel shaky after something like that." As they walked to the bench, James kept a careful eye on the three young men. Jake was sitting on the ground holding his sore arm and looking very angry. Tommy was slowly waking up and seemed confused about where he was. Carl was standing quietly by himself, looking ashamed and sorry for what had happened. Harold sat down on the park bench and took several deep breaths. James sat down beside him, but positioned himself so that he could still watch the three young men and react quickly if any of them tried to cause more trouble. "Thank you so much," Harold said to James. "I was really scared that they were going to hurt me or take my father's walking cane. This cane is one of my most precious possessions." James looked at the walking cane that Harold was holding so carefully. James could see that it was old and well made, and he could understand why it would be important to Harold. James also noticed that Harold was wearing a military cap, and James wanted to know more about Harold's military service. "Sir, I can see that you're wearing a military cap," James said respectfully. "Did you serve in the armed forces?" Harold's face brightened when James asked about his military service. Despite everything that had just happened, Harold was always proud to talk about his time as a soldier. "Yes, I served in World War II, Harold said with dignity. "I was in the British Army from 1943 to 1946. I fought in France and Germany." James felt a wave of deep respect when he heard this information. James knew that World War II veterans were becoming very rare, and he felt honored to meet someone who had served during that historic conflict. James also felt even more angry about what the three young men had tried to do to this war hero. "Sir, it is an honor to meet you," James said sincerely. "Thank you for your service to our country. The freedom that we enjoy today is thanks to brave men like you who were willing to fight for what is right." Harold was touched by James's respectful words. Harold was used to younger people not knowing much about World War II, or not caring about what had happened so long ago. It meant a great deal to Harold that this young man understood the importance of his military service. "What about you, young man?" Harold asked James. "The way you handled those three bullies was quite impressive. You clearly have some military training yourself." James smiled modestly. "Yes, sir. I'm currently serving in the British Army. I've been a soldier for 10 years now." Harold nodded approvingly. "I could tell that you were a professional soldier," Harold said. "The way you moved and the way you controlled that situation reminded me of the good soldiers I served with during the war." "What unit are you with?" James hesitated for a moment before answering. James was proud of his service with the Queen's Guard, but he also knew that some people treated him differently when they found out about his elite position. James preferred to be judged on his actions rather than on his rank or title. "I serve with the Queen's Guard," James said simply. Harold's eyes widened with surprise and respect. "The Queen's Guard?" Harold repeated. "My goodness. No wonder you handled those young men so easily. The Queen's Guard are some of the finest soldiers in the world." James felt pleased that Harold understood the significance of his military unit. James could see that Harold had a deep appreciation for military excellence and tradition. "Thank you, sir," James said. "We train very hard to maintain the highest standards. It's an honor to serve in such a prestigious unit." Harold looked at James with newfound respect and admiration. "When I was young and serving in the war, we all knew about the Queen's Guard. Even then, they were considered to be the best of the best. I never imagined that one day a member of the Queen's Guard would come to my rescue." James felt a strong connection to this elderly veteran. James could see that Harold understood and appreciated the military values of duty, honor, and service that James held so dear. James also realized that Harold represented a direct link to the history and traditions that James worked to protect every day. "Sir, soldiers like you paved the way for soldiers like me," James said with genuine emotion. "Your generation fought the battles that made it possible for my generation to serve in peace and freedom. I owe you a debt of gratitude that I can never fully repay." Harold felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to James's heartfelt words. Harold had not expected to have such a meaningful conversation when he started his morning walk, especially after the frightening encounter with the three young men. "You don't owe me anything," Harold said softly. "Knowing that fine young men like you are protecting our country today is all the thanks I need. It makes me feel that the sacrifices my generation made were worth it." The two men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each thinking about the bonds that connected them across the decades. Both had chosen to serve their country. Both understood the importance of protecting the innocent, and both had demonstrated courage in the face of danger. James looked over at the three young men, who were still sitting or standing nearby looking defeated and sorry for themselves. James knew that he would need to call the police so that the young men could be arrested for their attempted robbery and assault on Harold. "I should call the police now," James said to Harold. "Those three young men committed several crimes today, and they need to face the consequences of their actions." Harold nodded in agreement. "Yes, that's the right thing to do. Maybe spending some time in jail will help them understand that they can't go around threatening innocent people." James took out his mobile phone and dialed the emergency number for the police. While he was waiting for the call to be answered, James continued to watch the three young men to make sure they did not try to escape. "Hello, "This is Sergeant James Mitchell with the Queen's Guard," James said when the police operator answered the phone. "I need to report an attempted robbery and assault that just occurred in Windsor Park. I have 3 suspects in custody, and there is an elderly victim who will need to give a statement." The police operator took down all the necessary information and promised to send officers to the park immediately. James gave the operator the exact location where they were sitting and described what the 3 suspects looked like. After James finished the phone call, he turned back to Harold. "The police will be here in just a few minutes," James said. "They'll want to take statements from both of us about what happened." Harold nodded. "I'll be happy to tell them everything. Those young men need to learn that there are consequences for their bad behavior." As they waited for the police to arrive, James and Harold continued to talk about their military experiences and their love for their country. Both men felt that they had found a kindred spirit in each other, despite the difference in their ages and the different wars they had fought. The frightening morning that had started, with Harold being threatened by criminals, was turning into the beginning of a friendship that would mean a great deal to both men for years to come. The moment Jake grabbed James's shirt, everything changed in Windsor Park. James Mitchell's years of intensive military training took over his actions completely. What happened next occurred so quickly that Harold Thompson could barely follow the movements with his eyes. James used a technique he had learned during his combat training called a shirt grab release. With one swift motion, James grabbed Jake's wrist with his left hand and twisted it in a specific way that immediately caused Jake to let go of the shirt. At the same time, James used his right hand to apply pressure to a nerve point on Jake's arm. Jake cried out in pain and surprise as his arm was twisted in a direction it was not meant to go. Jake had expected to intimidate James with his aggressive grab, but instead Jake found himself experiencing sharp pain and losing control of the situation completely. "Let go of me," Jake shouted, but he was no longer in a position to make demands. James had control of Jake's arm and could increase or decrease the pain level depending on how Jake behaved. Tommy, seeing his friend in trouble, rushed forward to help Jake. But Tommy had no military training and no understanding of how to fight someone with professional combat skills. Tommy simply charged at James like an angry bull with no strategy or technique. James saw Tommy coming and was ready for him. James quickly released Jake's arm and stepped to the side, allowing Tommy to run past him. As Tommy went by, James used a technique called a redirect and takedown. James grabbed Tommy's shoulder and used Tommy's own forward momentum to send him tumbling to the ground. Tommy hit the grass hard and rolled several times before coming to a stop. Tommy was not seriously injured, but he was shocked and confused about how he had ended up on the ground. Tommy had thought he was attacking someone who would be easy to overpower, but instead, he had been handled like a child by someone who clearly knew what he was doing. Carl watched in amazement as his 2 friends were dealt with so easily and quickly. Carl had always thought that Jake and Tommy were tough and dangerous, but this stranger in running clothes was making them look foolish and weak. Carl began to back away from the group, hoping that he could escape before James turned his attention to him. But James was aware of all 3 young men at the same time. James's military training had taught him to keep track of multiple opponents and never to focus on just one person when others might be a threat. James could see Carl trying to back away, and James knew he needed to deal with all 3 young men to make sure Harold would be safe. Jake was holding his twisted arm and glaring at James with a mixture of pain and anger. "You're going to pay for that," Jake said through gritted teeth. Jake had never been defeated so easily before, and his pride was hurt even more than his arm. Jake tried to rush at James again, but this time James was ready with a different technique. James had been trained in several martial arts, including judo and military hand-to-hand combat. When Jake got close enough, James grabbed Jake's shirt and jacket and used a hip throw to send Jake flying through the air. Jake landed hard on his back on the grass, and all the air was knocked out of his lungs. Jake lay on the ground, gasping for breath and trying to figure out what had just happened to him. Jake had gone from being the aggressor to being completely helpless in less than 30 seconds. Harold watched all of this with a mixture of relief and amazement. Harold had been terrified that these 3 young men were going to hurt him, but now the young man who had come to help him was handling all 3 of them with ease. Harold could see that James was using professional fighting techniques, and Harold began to suspect that James was some kind of soldier or police officer. Tommy had gotten back to his feet and was preparing to attack James again. But Tommy was moving more slowly now, and he looked uncertain about what to do. Tommy had never been in a fight with someone who actually knew how to fight back effectively. James could see that Tommy was hesitating, and James decided to use a psychological technique along with his physical skills. "You don't want to do this," James said to Tommy in a calm but authoritative voice. "You're outmatched, and you're only going to get hurt if you continue. This is your chance to walk away." But Tommy was too proud and too angry to listen to good advice. Tommy picked up a stick from the ground and raised it over his head like a weapon. "I'll show you who's outmatched," Tommy shouted as he charged at James again. James sighed quietly to himself. He had tried to give Tommy a chance to end this peacefully, but Tommy had chosen to escalate the situation instead. James would now have to use more forceful techniques to protect himself and Harold. When Tommy swung the stick at James's head, James ducked under the swing and moved inside Tommy's reach. James used an elbow strike to Tommy's stomach, which caused Tommy to drop the stick and double over in pain. Then James used a technique called a sleeper hold to temporarily cut off the blood flow to Tommy's brain. Tommy struggled for a few seconds, but then his eyes rolled back and he went limp in James's arms. James gently lowered Tommy to the ground, where Tommy would sleep peacefully for a few minutes until the blood flow to his brain returned to normal. Tommy would wake up with a headache, but he would not be permanently injured. Carl had been watching all of this with growing terror. Carl could see that his two friends had been completely defeated by this stranger, and Carl knew that he would be next if he did not do something quickly. Carl looked around desperately for a way to escape or for some kind of weapon he could use. Carl spotted a large rock near the edge of the walking path. Carl grabbed the rock and raised it above his head, preparing to throw it at James. But before Carl could throw the rock, James had already moved to stop him. James covered the distance between himself and Carl in 3 quick steps. James grabbed Carl's wrist just as Carl was about to throw the rock, and James used a pressure point technique to make Carl's hand open involuntarily. The rock fell harmlessly to the ground. "Please don't hurt me," Carl said in a frightened voice. "I didn't really want to be part of this. Jake and Tommy made me come with them." James looked into Carl's eyes and could see that the young man was genuinely scared and regretful. James's military training had taught him to distinguish between different types of threats, and James could see that Carl was not really a dangerous person. "Then why did you come with them?" James asked Carl while still maintaining control of Carl's arm. "I don't know," Carl said, and tears began to form in his eyes. "I guess I was scared to say no to them. I don't have many friends, and I thought they liked me. But I can see now that they're not good friends at all." James studied Carl's face carefully and decided that the young man was telling the truth. James released Carl's arm but remained ready to react if Carl tried anything dangerous. "Listen to me carefully," James said to Carl in a serious but not unkind voice. "You need to choose better friends. Friends who pressure you into hurting innocent people are not real friends at all. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Carl nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. I understand. I'm sorry about what we did to the old man. We were wrong, and I feel terrible about it." James looked over at Harold, who was still standing nearby holding his walking cane. Harold looked shaken by everything that had happened, but he also looked relieved that the danger was over. Jake was starting to sit up slowly, still holding his sore arm. Tommy was beginning to stir on the ground but was not yet fully conscious. All 3 of the young men who had been threatening Harold just a few minutes ago were now completely defeated and no longer a threat to anyone. James had neutralized all 3 attackers in less than 2 minutes, using only his hands and his training. He had done it without causing any serious injuries and without losing control of the situation at any point. This was exactly the kind of professional, controlled response that James had been trained to provide as a member of the Queen's Guard. "Harold," Thompson looked at his rescuer with deep gratitude and growing curiosity about who this remarkable young man really was. James Mitchell stepped out from behind the trees and began walking calmly toward the group of 4 people on the walking path. Even though James was dressed in simple civilian clothes, his military bearing was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. James walked with perfect posture, his shoulders straight and his head held high. His steps were measured and purposeful, showing the confidence of someone who was used to being in control of difficult situations. As James approached the group, He quickly analyzed everything he could see. The elderly man looked frightened but was still standing upright with dignity. The three young men looked aggressive and were clearly enjoying the power they had over the elderly veteran. James could see that one of the young men was reaching toward the elderly man's military cap, which made James feel even more angry about the situation. James decided to announce his presence before he got too close to the group. He wanted to give the three young men a chance to stop their behavior and walk away peacefully. James always preferred to resolve conflicts without violence if possible, even though he was fully prepared to use force if necessary. "Excuse me," James said in a clear, calm voice that carried easily across the morning air. "Is there a problem here?" All four people turned to look at James as he approached them. Harold Thompson felt a wave of relief when he saw another person coming toward them. Harold had been hoping desperately that someone would come to help him, and now his prayers seemed to be answered. Jake, Tommy, and Carl were not pleased to see this interruption. They had been enjoying their power over the elderly man, and they did not want anyone else to interfere with their fun. Jake looked at James and saw a young man in running clothes who appeared to be alone. Jake thought that he and his friends could easily intimidate this new person, just like they were intimidating the elderly man. "No problem here, mate," Jake said to James in a rude tone of voice. "Just having a friendly conversation with our old friend here. Why don't you mind your own business and keep running?" James continued walking toward the group, his pace steady and unhurried. James could see the fear in Harold's eyes, and he could also see the aggressive body language of the three young men. James's military training allowed him to quickly assess the threat level of each person in the group. "It doesn't look like a very friendly conversation to me," James said calmly. "It looks like three young men are bothering an elderly gentleman who just wants to enjoy his morning walk." Tommy stepped forward and tried to make himself look more threatening. "Listen here, running boy," Tommy said with a sneer. "This doesn't concern you. The old man owes us some money, and we're just trying to collect what he owes us. So why don't you jog along before you get yourself into trouble?" James stopped walking when he was about 3 meters away from the group. This distance allowed James to move quickly in any direction if needed, while also being close enough to intervene immediately if the young men tried to hurt Harold. James's military training had taught him about proper positioning in potentially dangerous situations. "Sir," James said, speaking directly to Harold, "are you all right? Do you need any assistance?" Harold looked at James with grateful eyes. "Yes, please," Harold said in a shaky voice. "These young men are threatening me and trying to take my money and my walking cane. I haven't done anything wrong, and I just want to continue my walk in peace." Jake became very angry when he heard Harold asking James for help. Jake had expected the elderly man to be too frightened to speak up in front of a stranger. "Shut up, old man," Jake said harshly. "Nobody asked you to talk." James felt his jaw tighten when he heard Jake speak so rudely to the elderly veteran. James had been raised to respect older people, and his military service had taught him to have special respect for veterans. The idea of young men threatening and insulting a war veteran made James feel protective and angry. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here," James said, his voice still calm but now carrying a subtle note of authority. "This gentleman doesn't owe you anything, and you need to let him continue on his way immediately." Carl could sense that something was different about this new person who had joined their group. Carl noticed that James stood very straight and moved with confidence. Carl also noticed that James did not seem intimidated by the fact that he was outnumbered 3-1. Carl began to feel nervous about the situation. Tommy, however, was too arrogant to notice these warning signs. "Who do you think you are giving us orders?" Tommy said aggressively. "There are 3 of us and only 1 of you. Maybe you should be worried about yourself instead of worrying about the old man." James studied Tommy's face and body language carefully. James could see that Tommy was trying to act tough, but James could also see signs that Tommy was not as confident as he was pretending to be. James's military training had taught him how to read people and identify their weaknesses. "I'm someone who doesn't like to see elderly people being bullied," James said simply, "and I'm asking you politely to leave this gentleman alone and go about your business elsewhere." Jake laughed loudly at James's words. "Oh, you're asking us politely?" Jake said mockingly. "How sweet of you. Well, we're politely telling you to get lost before we decide to give you the same treatment we're giving the old man." James nodded slowly, as if he was considering Jake's words carefully. But inside, James was actually finalizing his tactical assessment of the situation. James had identified Jake as the leader of the group and the most aggressive of the three. James had also noticed that Carl seemed less committed to the confrontation than the other two. "I see," James said calmly. "So you're threatening me now as well as threatening this elderly gentleman. Is that correct?" Tommy stepped closer to James, trying to use his physical proximity to intimidate the newcomer. "That's right, hero," Tommy said with a nasty grin. "We're threatening you. What are you going to do about it?" James remained perfectly still as Tommy approached him. James's military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure and never to show fear or uncertainty, even in dangerous situations. James also knew that staying calm often confused and frustrated aggressive people, which could give him a tactical advantage. "Well," James said thoughtfully, as if he was seriously considering Tommy's question, "I suppose I have a few options available to me." Harold watched this exchange with growing concern. Harold could see that James was trying to help him, but Harold was worried that this kind young man might get hurt because of him. Harold did not want anyone else to be harmed because of his situation. "Please," Harold said to James, "you don't need to get involved in this. Maybe you should call the police instead." Jake immediately became angry when Harold mentioned the police. "Nobody's calling the police," Jake said loudly. "And nobody's leaving until we get what we came for." To emphasize his point, Jake reached out and grabbed James by the front of his t-shirt. This was exactly the kind of aggressive physical contact that James had been expecting and preparing for. The moment Jake's hand touched James's shirt, the situation changed completely. James's military training and combat experience immediately took over. In Jake's mind, he was just grabbing a random jogger who had interfered with their business. But in reality, Jake had just made physical contact with a highly trained member of the Queen's Guard, who had been taught to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. "That was a mistake," James said quietly, his voice now carrying a completely different tone of authority and controlled danger. Jake suddenly realized that something was very wrong. He could see a change in James's eyes and posture that he did not understand, but that made him feel suddenly afraid. Tommy and Carl also sensed that the situation had shifted in some important way. Harold, despite his fear, found himself holding his breath as he watched what was about to happen. Harold's old military instincts told him that this young man who had come to help him was not an ordinary civilian. Harold could see something in James's bearing that reminded him of the professional soldiers he had known during the war, the OWR. Three young men who had been terrorizing Harold. Thompson were about to discover that they had picked the wrong person to threaten on this particular morning in Windsor Park. Just 50 meters away from where Harold Thompson was being threatened by the three young men, another person was having his own morning routine in Windsor Park. This person was very different from Harold, but in some important ways, they were more alike than anyone could have imagined. Sergeant James Mitchell was 28 years old and had been serving in the British Army for 10 years. James was not just any soldier. He was a member of the Queen's Guard, one of the most elite and respected military units in the United Kingdom. James had trained for years to earn his position, and he took great pride in his service to his country. This morning, James was not wearing his famous red uniform with the tall black hat that most people recognize from pictures of Buckingham Palace. Instead, James was dressed in simple civilian clothes, gray running shorts, a blue t-shirt, and white running shoes. He was taking his morning run through Windsor Park, which was part of his daily fitness routine. Even when he was off duty, James maintained the strict physical standards required of the Queen's Guard. Every morning at 6:30, James would run 5 miles through different parts of Windsor. He varied his route each day to keep his training interesting and to explore different areas of the town where he was stationed. James had been running for about 20 minutes when he decided to take a short break. He stopped near a large oak tree to stretch his leg muscles and drink some water from the bottle he carried with him. James was not tired from the run, but he believed in pacing himself properly to avoid injury. As James was stretching against the oak tree, he heard voices coming from a nearby section of the park. At first, James did not pay much attention to the voices. People often talked and laughed in the park, especially in the morning when dog walkers and joggers were out enjoying the fresh air. But something about these voices made James stop stretching and listen more carefully. His military training had taught him to be aware of his surroundings at all times, even when he was off duty. James had learned to recognize different types of sounds and to identify when something might be wrong. The voices James was hearing did not sound friendly or casual. They sounded aggressive and threatening. James could hear one voice that was older and sounded frightened. He could hear other voices that were younger and sounded angry and mean. James's instincts, developed through years of military service and combat training, immediately told him that someone might be in trouble. James had served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, where being able to quickly assess dangerous situations had been a matter of life and death. James moved quietly from behind the oak tree and looked in the direction where the voices were coming from. Through the trees and bushes, James could see a group of people standing on one of the walking paths. James moved closer, being careful to stay hidden behind the trees so that he could observe the situation without being seen. What James saw made his blood run cold. An elderly man wearing a military cap was surrounded by 3 young men who were clearly threatening him. James could see that the elderly man was holding a walking cane and appeared to be very frightened. The 3 young men were standing too close to the elderly man and were preventing him from walking away. James had excellent eyesight, and even from a distance he could see the military cap that Harold was wearing. James immediately recognized it as a World War II veteran's cap. James felt a surge of anger and protective instinct when he realized that these young men were threatening a war veteran. In the Queen's Guard, James had been taught to have the deepest respect for military veterans, especially those who had served during World War II. James knew that these elderly veterans had sacrificed enormously for their country and deserved to be honored and protected, not threatened by young criminals. James moved even closer, using the trees and bushes as cover so that he could hear what was being said. He positioned himself where he could see everything clearly, but where the 3 young men could not see him. James watched as one of the young men pushed the elderly veteran, causing him to stumble and nearly fall. James's hands automatically clenched into fists when he saw this. Every instinct in James's body was telling him to rush forward immediately and stop what was happening. But James's military training had also taught him to be disciplined and strategic. James knew that rushing into a situation without proper planning could sometimes make things worse instead of better. James forced himself to stay hidden and observe for a few more moments so that he could understand exactly what he was dealing with. James counted the 3 young men and assessed their size and apparent physical condition. James could see that all 3 were smaller than he was, and they appeared to be ordinary young men without any special fighting skills. James was confident that he could handle all 3 of them if necessary, but he hoped that the situation could be resolved without violence. James looked around the area to see if there were any other people nearby who might be able to help. Unfortunately, this part of the park was isolated, and James could not see any other people within shouting distance. James realized that he was probably the only person who could help the elderly veteran. James began to plan his approach carefully. His military training had taught him several techniques for dealing with multiple opponents. James knew how to position himself strategically, how to use surprise to his advantage, and how to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. James also considered whether he should try to call for police assistance. But James realized that it would take several minutes for police to arrive, and the elderly man might be seriously hurt during those minutes. James decided that he needed to act immediately to protect the veteran. James listened as one of the young men threatened to take the elderly man's walking cane and break it in half. James could hear the pain and fear in the elderly man's voice as he begged them not to take his father's cane. This made James even more determined to intervene. James checked his own physical condition quickly. He was warmed up from his run. His muscles were loose and ready for action, and his mind was clear and focused. James felt confident that he was prepared for whatever might happen next. James also thought about the legal aspects of the situation. In British law, James had the right to use reasonable force to protect another person from harm. James was confident that intervening to help the elderly veteran would be legally justified, especially since the 3 young men were clearly committing a crime. James took a deep breath and prepared to move from his hiding place. He planned his approach route carefully, identifying exactly where he would step and how he would position himself relative to the 3 young men. James wanted to appear suddenly and take control of the situation before the young men had time to react. James said a quick, Silent prayer for the safety of the elderly veteran, and for the wisdom to handle the situation properly. Then James began to move forward, stepping quietly but purposefully toward the group of people on the walking path. James Mitchell, trained guardian of the Queen and protector of the innocent, was about to reveal himself and change the course of this dangerous morning encounter. The three young men threatening Harold Thompson had no idea that they were about to face someone with skills and training far beyond anything they could imagine. The peaceful morning in Windsor Park was about to become much more interesting. The situation around Harold Thompson was getting worse by the minute. The three young men had formed a tight circle around him, and Harold could feel the danger growing stronger. His heart was beating fast inside his chest and his hands were starting to shake slightly, but Harold tried his best to stay calm and think clearly about what to do. Jake stepped even closer to Harold, so close that Harold could see the angry expression in the young man's eyes. "Listen here, old-timer," Jake said in a threatening voice. "We think you might have some money in those pockets of yours. Why don't you share some of that money with us young guys who really need it?" Harold looked directly at Jake and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "I don't have much money with me, and even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you. You should find honest work if you need money, not bother old people in the park." Tommy laughed loudly at Harold's words. "Honest work? Did you hear that, guys? The old man thinks we should get jobs." Tommy's laugh was mean and cruel. "Why should we work when we can just take what we want from people like you?" Carl shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. He could see that Harold was scared, even though the old man was trying to be brave. Carl's conscience was telling him that this was wrong, but he was too afraid of his friends to speak up. Carl had been in this situation before, and he knew that Jake could become very angry if anyone disagreed with him. Harold tried to take a step backward, hoping to create some space between himself and the young men, but every time Harold moved, one of the three young men moved to block his path. They were making sure that Harold could not walk away from them. "Please," Harold said, trying to reason with them. "I'm just an old man trying to enjoy my morning walk. I've never hurt any of you, and I don't understand why you want to hurt me. Can't you just let me continue on my way?" Jake's face became even more angry when he heard Harold's words. "Hurt you? We're not going to hurt you, old man. We just want what's in your pockets, and maybe we want to teach you a lesson about respect. You think you're better than us because you're wearing that old military hat?" Harold felt a flash of anger when Jake insulted his military cap. That cap represented some of the most important years of Harold's life. It reminded him of the friends he had served with, the battles they had fought together, and the freedom they had helped to protect. But Harold controlled his anger because he knew that getting upset would not help his situation. "This hat represents my service to my country," Harold said with dignity. "I earned the right to wear it by serving in World War II. I fought alongside brave men who gave their lives so that people like you could live in freedom." Tommy made a rude sound with his mouth. "World War II? That was like 100 years ago, old man. Nobody cares about that ancient history anymore. The world has moved on, and so should you." These words hurt Harold more than any physical attack could have. Harold had lost many good friends during the war. He had seen terrible things and had been forced to do difficult things in order to survive and protect others. The idea that his service and sacrifice meant nothing to these young men made Harold feel very sad and disappointed. Jake decided it was time to make their demands more serious. "Enough talking," Jake said harshly. "Empty your pockets right now, old man. Give us whatever money you have, and maybe we'll let you walk away without any bruises." Harold straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Jake. Even though Harold was afraid, his military training had taught him never to give in to bullies. "I will not give you my money," Harold said firmly. "If you want money, you should earn it honestly, not steal it from innocent people." Jake's face turned red with anger. "Wrong answer, Grandpa," Jake said through clenched teeth. Without warning, Jake reached out and gave Harold a hard push on the shoulder. Harold was not expecting the push, and his old body could not react quickly enough to keep his balance. Harold stumbled backward, his walking cane waving in the air as he tried to steady himself. For a terrible moment, Harold thought he was going to fall down completely. He could imagine himself hitting the hard pavement and breaking his hip or his arm. Fortunately, Harold managed to catch his balance at the last second. He used his walking cane to support himself and prevented the fall. But the push had shaken Harold badly, both physically and emotionally. Harold realized that these young men were willing to use violence against him, and that made the situation much more dangerous. "Leave me alone," Harold said, his voice now showing the fear he was feeling. "I'm 91 years old. How can you threaten an old man like this?" But Harold's words only seemed to encourage the three young men. They could see that Harold was getting more scared, and they thought this meant they were winning. Tommy moved closer to Harold and pointed at the walking cane. "Nice stick you got there, old man. Looks like it might be worth some money. Why don't you hand it over?" Harold gripped his walking cane more tightly. The cane was not just a tool to help him walk. It had belonged to his father before him, and it was one of Harold's most treasured possessions. The idea of giving it to these cruel young men made Harold feel sick to his stomach. "This cane belonged to my father," Harold said, trying to explain why it was so important to him. "It's not worth much money, but it means everything to me. Please don't take it away from me." Jake smiled in a mean way when he heard how much the cane meant to Harold. "Oh, so it's special to you? That makes it even more fun to take away from you. Maybe we'll break it in half just to watch you cry." Carl felt very uncomfortable when he heard Jake say these cruel words. Carl knew that his friends were going too far, but he still did not have the courage to tell them to stop. Carl looked around the park, hoping that someone else would come along and interrupt what was happening. But the area where they were standing was isolated, and Carl could not see any other people nearby. Harold was beginning to realize that these young men might seriously hurt him. His mind went back to his military training from so many years ago. Harold remembered how to assess a dangerous situation and how to look for ways to escape or defend himself. But Harold also knew that his 91-year-old body was not capable of fighting three young men. Harold tried one more time to appeal to whatever goodness might exist in these young men. "I have a daughter and grandchildren," Harold said, his voice becoming emotional. "They love me and depend on me. If you hurt me, you'll be hurting them too. Please think about what you're doing." But Jake, Tommy, and Carl were not interested in hearing about Harold's family. They had chosen to see Harold as a target, not as a real person with people who loved him. Tommy reached toward Harold's military cap again. "I think I'll take this hat as a souvenir," Tommy said with a nasty grin. Harold jerked his head away from Tommy's reaching hand. "Don't touch my hat," Harold said with as much authority as he could manage. The three young men were getting more aggressive and more confident. They could see that Harold was alone and vulnerable, and they believed that no one was going to come to help him. They had no idea that someone with very special skills was already watching everything that was happening. Harold felt more helpless and frightened than he had felt in many years. He wished that someone would come along to help him, but he could not see anyone else in this part of the park. Harold said a silent prayer that somehow this terrible situation would end without anyone getting seriously hurt. The morning that had started so peacefully for Harold Thompson was turning into a nightmare that he would never forget. Harold reached the entrance to Windsor Park just as the sun was getting brighter in the sky. The park gates were always open, and Harold could see the walking paths that wound through the green grass and tall trees. This park had been his favorite place for many years. He came here every morning to walk, sit on his favorite bench, and watch the world around him. The park was quiet at this early hour. Harold could see a few other early morning people in the distance. There was a woman jogging along one of the paths. There was an older man walking his small dog near the pond. Harold felt comfortable here among these peaceful morning people who, like him, enjoyed the quiet start to each day. Harold walked through the park gates and started down his usual path. He moved slowly but with purpose, his cane tapping steadily on the paved walkway. The morning air smelled fresh and clean. Harold could smell the grass, the flowers, and the clean scent that comes after a light rain during the night. As Harold walked deeper into the park, he did not notice the three young men who had been sitting on a bench near the entrance. These young men were not like the other peaceful morning visitors. They were loud, restless, and looking for trouble. They had been in the park since very late the night before, and they were not there for any good reason. The three young men saw Harold as soon as he walked through the gates. They noticed his slow, careful way of walking. They saw his walking cane and his old military cap. They looked at his clean, neat clothes and the respectful way he carried himself. Instead of seeing a man who deserved respect, they saw what they thought was an easy target. The first young man was named Jake. He was 22 years old and had short, messy brown hair. Jake wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, even though the morning was not very cold. He had been in trouble with the police several times before. Jake was the leader of this small group, and the other two usually followed his ideas, even when those ideas were bad. The second young man was called Tommy. He was only 19 years old, but he tried to act tough like Jake. Tommy had blonde hair and wore old, dirty clothes. He came from a family that had many problems, and he had learned to be angry at the world. Tommy thought that being mean to other people made him seem strong and important. The third young man was named Carl. He was 21 years old and was the quietest of the three. Carl had dark hair and was taller than his friends. He often felt uncomfortable when Jake and Tommy wanted to cause trouble, but he was too scared to stand up to them. Carl wished he had better friends, but he did not know how to change his situation. Jake nudged Tommy with his elbow and pointed toward Harold. "Look at that old man," Jake said in a mean voice, "walking around like he owns the place. Bet he's got money in his pockets." Tommy laughed in a cruel way. "Yeah, look at those nice clean clothes. And that military hat. Probably thinks he's still a soldier or something." Carl felt uncomfortable but did not say anything. He watched Harold walking peacefully along the path and felt bad about what his friends were thinking. But Carl was too afraid of Jake and Tommy to tell them to leave the old man alone. The three young men got up from their bench and started following Harold. They stayed far enough behind him so that he would not notice them at first. Jake was making plans in his head. He thought about different ways they could scare the old man and take whatever money he might have. Harold continued walking along his favorite path, enjoying the peaceful morning. He stopped for a moment to look at some flowers that were blooming near the walkway. Harold had always loved flowers, especially since his wife Mary had taught him about different types of plants and how to care for them. Looking at flowers made him feel close to Mary's memory. While Harold was looking at the flowers, the three young men moved closer to him. They spread out so that they could surround him if they wanted to. Jake signaled to Tommy and Carl with his hands, showing them where they should position themselves. The three young men had done this kind of thing before, and they knew how to work together to intimidate people. Harold finished looking at the flowers and continued walking. He still did not know that anyone was following him. Harold was thinking about his plans for the rest of the day. After his walk, he would go home and read the newspaper. Then he might work in his small garden or call his daughter who lived in another city. The young men continued following Harold for several more minutes. They waited until he reached a part of the park that was more isolated, where there were fewer people around. This area had tall trees on both sides of the path, and it was harder for other people to see what was happening. Jake decided it was time to make their move. He whispered quick instructions to Tommy and Carl. Then the three young men spread out and started walking faster to catch up with Harold. Their footsteps became louder and more aggressive as they approached the elderly man. Harold heard the footsteps behind him and turned around to see what was happening. He saw three young men walking toward him with unfriendly expressions on their faces. Harold's military training from many years ago made him aware that something was wrong. His body became tense and his grip tightened on his walking cane. "Good morning," Harold said politely, hoping that these young men were just passing by and meant no harm. Harold always tried to be friendly with people, even when he felt unsure about their intentions. Jake stepped closer to Harold and looked him up and down with a mean expression. Well, Jake said in a mocking tone. "What do we have here? An old soldier boy out for his morning walk?" Tommy moved to Harold's left side while Carl reluctantly moved to his right side. Now Harold was surrounded by the three young men, and he could not easily walk away from them. Harold felt his heart start to beat faster, but he tried to stay calm and think clearly. "I'm just taking my morning walk," Harold said in a steady voice. "I don't want any trouble with anyone." Jake laughed in a nasty way. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble, old man? We just want to have a friendly conversation with you." But Harold could see in Jake's eyes that this was not going to be a friendly conversation. Harold had seen that same look in people's eyes during the war. It was the look of someone who wanted to hurt other people. Harold knew he was in danger, but he also knew that showing fear would only make things worse. The three young men moved even closer to Harold. They were now standing so close that Harold could smell the stale cigarette smoke on their clothes. Harold tried to step backward, but Carl was standing behind him, blocking his path. "Nice hat, old man," Tommy said, reaching toward Harold's military cap. "Mind if I take a look at it?" Harold pulled his head back and held his cane more tightly. "Please leave me alone," Harold said firmly. "I haven't done anything to you and I don't want any problems." But Jake and his friends were not interested in leaving Harold alone. They had decided that this old man would be their victim this morning, and they were not going to change their minds. They did not care that Harold was a war veteran who had served his country. They did not care that he was someone's father and grandfather. All they cared about was what they could take from him. The peaceful morning in the park was about to become much more dangerous for Harold Thompson. The alarm clock rang at exactly 6 in the morning. Harold Thompson opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of his small bedroom. At 91 years old, he had been waking up at this same time for more than 70 years. His body was old and tired, but his mind was still sharp and clear. Harold slowly sat up in his bed. His joints made small popping sounds as he moved. This happened every morning now. He did not mind it anymore. Getting old meant that his body made different sounds than when he was young. He had learned to accept these changes over the years. He put his feet on the cold wooden floor and stood up carefully. Harold had fallen once last year, and he did not want that to happen again. The fall had scared him more than he wanted to admit. Since then, he moved more slowly and held on to things when he walked around his house. Harold walked to his small bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror. His hair was completely white now, and his face had many lines and wrinkles. But his blue eyes were still bright and alert. Those same eyes had seen many things during his long life. They had seen war, peace, love, loss, and everything in between. He washed his face with cold water and brushed his teeth. Harold still had most of his own teeth, which made him proud. Many people his age had false teeth, but he had taken good care of his real ones. His dentist always said he had the teeth of a much younger man. After getting dressed, Harold went to his kitchen. He always wore the same type of clothes every day. Dark blue pants, a white shirt, and a brown sweater. In the winter, he added a warm coat. In the summer, he left the sweater at home. Harold liked having a routine. It made his life feel organized and peaceful. He made himself a cup of tea and ate a piece of toast with butter. Harold had eaten the same breakfast for the past 20 years. Some people might find this boring, but he found it comforting. When you are 91 years old, comfort becomes more important than excitement. While he ate his breakfast, Harold looked out his kitchen window. He could see the street outside his house. It was still dark, but he could see the streetlights glowing in the early morning. Soon the sun would come up and his neighbors would start their day too. But Harold always liked being the first one awake on his street. After finishing his breakfast, Harold went to his bedroom closet. He reached for something very special to him. It was his old military cap from when he served in World War II. The cap was faded and worn, but Harold took very good care of it. He cleaned it gently every week and stored it carefully when he was not wearing it. Harold put the cap on his head and looked at himself in the mirror again. When he wore this cap, he remembered the young soldier he used to be. He remembered his friends who had fought beside him during the war. Most of those friends were gone now, but Harold still felt connected to them when he wore his military cap. He picked up his walking cane from beside his bed. The cane was made of dark wood and had a curved handle. Harold had started using the cane 3 years ago when his legs became weaker. At first he felt embarrassed about needing help to walk, but now the cane felt like an old friend. It helped him feel more confident when he walked outside. Harold went to his front door and put on his coat. Even though it was spring, the mornings were still cold in Windsor, England. He had lived in this same house for 45 years. He knew every street, every shop, and many of the people in his neighborhood. This place felt like home to him in every way possible. Before leaving his house, Harold checked his pockets. He had his house keys, a small amount of money, and a handkerchief. He also carried a small photo of his wife, Mary, who had died 5 years ago. Harold missed Mary every single day, but carrying her photo made him feel like she was still with him on his walks. Harold opened his front door and stepped outside. The air was fresh and cool. He could smell the flowers growing in his neighbor's garden. Spring was his favorite time of year because everything seemed new and full of life. Even though he was very old, Harold still enjoyed seeing the world wake up each morning. He locked his front door and started walking down his street. Harold moved slowly but steadily. His cane tapped gently on the sidewalk with each step. Tap, step, tap, step. This sound had become the rhythm of his daily walks. Some days, Harold pretended he was marching like a soldier again. It made him smile and feel younger. The streets were mostly empty at this early hour. Harold liked it this way. He could walk at his own pace without feeling like he was slowing other people down. Sometimes younger people would walk behind him and seem impatient. Harold understood this, but it still made him feel bad about being slow. As he walked, Harold looked at the houses on his street. He knew the people who lived in most of them. There was Mrs. Peterson, who always grew beautiful roses in her front yard. There was Mr. and Mrs. Williams, who had 3 young children. There was the young couple who had just moved in last month. Harold enjoyed watching his neighborhood change and grow over the years. Harold turned the corner and continued walking toward the park. This was his destination every morning. The park was about 10 minutes away from his house if he walked at his normal pace. Sometimes it took longer if he stopped to rest or if he met someone he knew along the way. The sun was starting to rise now, and the sky was becoming lighter. Harold could hear birds singing in the trees. This sound always made him happy. During the war, Harold had learned to appreciate simple, peaceful sounds like birds singing. After hearing bombs and gunfire for so long, the sound of birds felt like a gift. Harold continued walking toward the park, feeling grateful for another morning and another chance to enjoy his daily routine. He had no idea that this morning would be different from all the others. He did not know that this walk would change his life and introduce him to someone who would become very important to him. For now, Harold just enjoyed the peaceful morning and the familiar rhythm of his footsteps in cane on the sidewalk. Tap, step, tap, step. He was simply a 91-year-old man taking his daily walk, wearing his military cap with pride, and remembering the long, full life he had lived.